We are finishing up a series of talks that we've been giving on the 10 Paramis, which is a more popular teaching in Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, and it's also an aspect of Theravadan Buddhism, which is primarily kind of the school that Wildheart associates themselves with. But the Paramis are these qualities, these kind of almost, I would almost call them in some ways psychological qualities, in some ways we could maybe call them spiritual qualities, but they're kind of the culmination of the Buddhist path, right? Like if you undertake this path, these are kind of the 10 things that we're aiming for. So it's a good little like table of contents of what we're trying to cultivate and develop through this practice. And we've gone through all of them so far: generosity, ethical integrity, renunciation, wisdom, energy, patience, truthfulness, resolution, loving kindness, and now we're at the end, equanimity. And you'll notice in Theravadan Buddhism there are a lot of lists, and we talk about this a lot. Sometimes we refer to ourselves as list worshippers. And equanimity comes at the end of a lot of those lists. And so I think that the goal of this practice is equanimity. It's what we're shooting for. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Buddha's mythological story of his awakening. I mean, who knows if it's myth or not, but I don't know the man, so we'll just call it a myth at this point. But what happened during the Buddha's awakening and what ultimately led to this profound experience of equanimity? You know, the story goes that the Buddha was raised into a life of luxury. He had everything that he wanted. He was basically born into a very wealthy family, sheltered from the world. One day went out into the market, into the village, into the town, and he saw a lot of the suffering of the world. He saw people with ailments. He saw people close to death. He saw people basically being unprovided for. And he had this kind of existential crisis, which I think we all have had these experiences, maybe not in this exact way. But this word in Pali Sanskrit is samvega. And I love this word. I love that this was included in the Buddha story, because samvega, it translates to mean something like spiritual urgency. And so he has this moment of awakening, but it's a rude awakening. And it's an awakening into the suffering that exists in the world. It's something that I really was drawn towards with the Buddhist teaching. Not everybody is this way, and that's why I'm glad there are a lot of different spiritual traditions. But I don't know if it's my conditioning or whatever, but I was just like, okay, the way that the Buddha found this path and the thing that he started with was suffering. And, maybe because also I have a high threshold for following a path. It was only until I found a significant amount of suffering that I was like, shit, maybe I'll meditate. Maybe I'll figure out what the Buddha has to say and give this a try, right? I think it was the only way that I probably was going to get in any type of spiritual practice. So I appreciate that. So the Buddha has this moment of samvega, of spiritual urgency, and it comes about because of his awareness of suffering in the world, and he decides to leave home, and he decides, I've got to basically find a way to deal with this suffering. I've got to find freedom. I've got to find peace, happiness, whatever it is. I don't even think he knew what he was looking for. He was just like, this sheltered life isn't it. I've got to go out. And so that's what he did. He just left home and he went out and he undertook found some other spiritual homies on the road, and they taught him some different practices, and he did some of those. And he went to this kind of other extreme where he basically found the most hardcore spiritual practitioners he could, the ascetics, and they practiced these austere spiritual practices of depriving themselves of pleasure, thinking that the cause of suffering in the world was that the body craves or the body wants pleasure. And so they said, okay, the thing we need to do then is get rid of that. We need to find a way to extinguish pleasure. And so they starved themselves, they fed themselves, the stories say, 1 grain of rice, like a month. All sorts of, pretty tortured practices that still exist to this day, by the way. And so the Buddha went down this other extreme, and he, basically close to death and starvation, this other type of existential crisis happened where he said, this isn't it either. Getting everything I wanted and having all the pleasure and all of the joy, everything at my disposal wasn't it, and punishing myself wasn't it either. And so he doesn't know what to do, basically, and fortunately this lady comes around, Sujata, and feeds him back into health. And he gets healthy enough to walk over to this Bodhi tree, and he sits down and he says, all right, I'm just going to sit here. And actually, there's a piece in the text that say that the Buddha reminisced of a time when he was young. This is really interesting. He had this moment where he kind of had this recall of a time when he was young, and I think it said he was at a parade in his village. And he was just sitting up on the hill, and he was just sitting there kind of peacefully breathing and knowing he was breathing. He wasn't trying to push anything away, he wasn't trying to make anything happen, he was just kind of delighting in the experience of being alive and breathing. And he said, okay, I'm going to try that. So he sits under the Bodhi tree and he breathes. And it occurs to him that maybe he could just open his awareness to his experience and observe what it was like to have a mind and what it was like to have an emotional heart and what it was like to have a body, and just simply observe. That's it. And so he opens his awareness in this kind of loving and mindful way, and he starts to see with clarity sensations and feelings, emotions and thoughts were all kind of constructing reality. His sense of self was being constructed by this. His reactivity towards life was being constructed to this. And, in summary, the Buddha basically saw that our happiness wasn't dependent on the experiences that we're in, but the way that the mind interprets and relates to the experiences that we're in. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, and we'll get to this, I'm not saying that pain is related to how your mind interprets and reacts, but suffering. This extra layer of dissatisfaction that the mind creates is mind-made, as the Buddha says later. So he starts to see this. The mind is interpreting and reacting to experience. And this shows up in the form of course, a friendly neighborhood devil named Mara. And Mara comes to visit this reactivity of the mind, comes to visit the Buddha in these different forms, greed, hatred, and delusion, basically. And what's interesting is what does the Buddha do when the reactivity of the mind, when the suffering of the mind comes to visit? Now, I think this is really fascinating. I'll get a little bit on my soapbox here. I think it's kind of badass that in Buddhism, in the Buddha's Dharma, the thing that the Buddha does is he simply says, I see you, Mara. He doesn't banish the devil. He doesn't, view this as something that's wrong or something that needs to, go away even. He just simply says, I see you. I see you, reactive mind. I see you suffering. And it's said that even after the Buddha's enlightenment, Mara would come to visit. So this is a fully enlightened being. Devil still comes to hang out with the Buddha sometimes. And the Buddha will say in these discourses, Mara will hide in these different forms. And I think for the Buddha, this is my interpretation, he's trying to do the right thing in these moments, but Mara's kind of hiding. And then the Buddha will get this weird feeling, and he'll just be like, wait a second, is that you, Mara? And Mara will appear from behind the cabinet. It's like, I see you, Mara, I see you. So, how I choose to look at this story, I think it's a beautiful story, is that, it's also very resonant to me personally, is I've never been able to hate myself into being a better person. I've never been able to hate my experience into making it different. I'm never, on the inverse, I've never been able to crave myself into an experience of happiness either. And so this is this middle path of just kind of really sitting in the middle of our lives without reactivity. Peace for me isn't this place that exists that once I have this special knowledge, or once I, do the million hours of whatever, or study with the best gurus, or read all the best philosophy, like I haven't found it anywhere. It only exists in the here and now. And the Buddha points to this in his teaching after his awakening. He says that this Dharma, this path of awakening, is subtle and hard to see. And he says that where you can find it is in this, he says, this conditionality, which means this kind of moment-to-moment process, that it exists here. So what does this story tell us of the Buddha's path? Is he sees these reactive mind states, we call them Mara here, but he doesn't try to get rid of them. But he also doesn't get lost in following them either. And this is what equanimity is. Ajahn Chah says, try to be mindful and let things take their course. Then your mind will become still in any surrounding, like a still forest pool. All kinds of wonderful animals will come to drink at the pool, and you will clearly see the nature of all things. You will see many strange and wonderful things come and go, but you will be still. This is the happiness of the Buddha. I like this metaphor of sitting at a pool with all of these strange and wonderful things happening at it. That's not the packaging of peace that I get marketed to me. I get a serene pool, and there are no kids running around splashing in it. It's like an oasis removed from everything. I got my own waiter. That's the pool that I always think I'm going to get. And the reason why I say this is actually I think it's a huge problem when we think that's what we're trying to get. I think it's a huge problem because you don't get it. And you continually think that there's something wrong with you, or that you're not doing it right, or you're not, and we go around, running around, the Buddha calls it, in this and that. We run around just trying to find this resort, pool. But there are always tourists there. And so Ajahn Chah says that your mind can become still in any surrounding. And I look at this as what equanimity is. I want to offer a little bit of an overview of equanimity and share some of the qualities of it and how we maybe look at it through the Buddhist path. Just because I think it's helpful to know there is a lot of information. And although the information won't liberate you, it may help along the way. So the word for equanimity, as a lot of the Pali Sanskrit words in the original text is, I think, a lot better of a word than the word equanimity. I don't use that word. Before I got here, I didn't really have any personal emotional connection to the word equanimity. The word in Pali Sanskrit is upekkha, and upekkha translates to mean there in the middleness. So it's a quality of being able to really be here, to be with whatever the experience is. And it's a quality of being able to be open and really intimately present with the experience we're in, also without getting pushed and pulled around by the experience. That's hard. And so this is not to say your mind won't have reactivity, but we're kind of using mindfulness to step back from the reactivity, to observe it. Does that make sense? So it's a really actually subtle thing. As soon as I get in this habit of trying to not be reactive, I'm being reactive. It's like, damn it, you can't win. But if I can step back and observe the reactivity and really just be present and aware and patient, equanimity develops through that. And I can't really explain that. I mean, I think in neuroscience they call this your window of tolerance, and they say that you can expand your window of tolerance. So actually your brain can get better at being less reactive if you expose yourself to things that are uncomfortable. It's the basis of gradual exposure therapy. I mean, there's a lot of like psychology stuff with this. But I still can't really explain it, is that somehow by sitting with reactivity, the mind learns, the body knows that it can make it through that experience without grabbing onto it or without pushing it away. And the body and the mind learns to be peaceful in any surrounding. This has been my experience with meditation practice. And you don't have to believe me that gratefully the Buddha has this other term. He says it's called ehipassiko, which means to come and see for yourself. But this has been my experience, is that over time, the greatest gift I've been given through this practice is equanimity. And my mind's still reactive, and I still get angry, and I still can be critical, and I can still, want to eat Wendy's 5 times a day, and crave and cling and all of those things. But there's a lot more peace. So in meditation, we can develop this too. We can sit with sensation and feeling, with the mind states, the moods, the mental attitudes. We can sit with our thoughts. We can open to the experience, and we can just be aware. We don't have to get pulled in. We will, but we can come back to the breath. We don't have to push it away. We will, but we can say, oh no, pain in the knee, you're welcome here too. And this ability to let our sensory experience, sensations and feelings and moods and thoughts come and go without push and pull, it cools the fire of reactivity. It conditions the mind to let go. Because our biology is such that we hate pain and we crave pleasure. And if you're thinking to yourself, no, not me, you're wrong. And I envy you, because it's very apparent to me that I hate pain and crave pleasure. And having a daughter, it's like she's 5 years old. This is the perfect territory to recognize how impersonal our evolutionary biology of hating pain and craving pleasure. It's like my daughter's way of getting over a moment of discomfort is like another moment of pleasure. She's just like chasing throughout the day, is like, what's the next pleasant experience I can have? And as a parent, I'm trying to be like, we can't always have pleasant experiences. And she's like, ah! And then I'm like, this is really unpleasant. Can I just give her a pleasant experience to make this go away? And then I'm like, oh shit, I can't do that, because, all right. But yeah, it's kind of in our biology. And so rather than just swimming along with this stream of reactivity, the Buddha offers us a practice of mindfulness. And we can develop clear seeing of the reactivity. And we can develop a different way of responding. And I also wanted to speak for a moment about these different ways of responding. Beyond mindfulness, which is this awareness practice, the Buddha also offers us these qualities, these not reactive but responsive qualities that we can cultivate. So rather than hating pain, we can cultivate compassion. Right? And he says the wise response to pain is compassion rather than hatred. And rather than clinging to pleasure, we can practice non-attached appreciation. Right? We can practice this ability to fully inhabit a pleasant moment or a pleasant experience and letting it be good enough, letting it be impermanent, not having to cling and hold on. And there are other two qualities. There's loving kindness and equanimity, which the Buddha is saying are appropriate in all moments of experience, whether they're pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So it's kind of like for pleasant moments, non-attached appreciation. For unpleasant moments, compassion. And for all moments, including those, loving kindness and equanimity. And these are called the Brahma Viharas. Interestingly, I'm just kind of talking about what resonated with me in the Buddhist teaching early on, is I really loved this teaching too because, I've since gotten over a lot of my baggage around religion, but I had a lot of it when I came in. I think a lot of us do because, hey, we're in a Buddhist community center in the South, right? When I came in, I had a lot of baggage, and I heard this word Brahma Vihara. I was like, wait a second, Brahma. I was like thinking back to world history classes. Like Brahma means like God or creator. I was like, is there a God or a creator in Buddhism? And then I found out that Vihara meant home. And I figured out that this teaching was kind of taught around basically a couple people that were debating whose creator was like right. And they like came to the Buddha and they're like, who's right? My creator or yours or whoever? And the Buddha was like, I don't know. He said, but if you're looking for God, if you're looking for the creator, you can find the home of God right here. Right? In these qualities, in loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. I actually think it's a really beautiful teaching. He's saying, let's not worry so much about what to call it or where it is or whose is right or wrong. He's like, let's actually just try to embody these qualities. And I feel like it's self-evident. Like when I'm being compassionate, it's like that feels good. Like I don't have to, there's no like scientific research book I need on that. It just like feels good. When someone's been compassionate towards me, it just feels good. And so these are these qualities that can help us to cool the fires of reactivity. And equanimity is one of them. And so the way that this is taught is the Buddha didn't elaborate a lot on the Brahma Viharas. A lot of the teachings came after his death, but I think they're really good. And so one of the teachings that came a few hundred years after his death was on this thing called the near enemies, which is all of these qualities actually themselves, even equanimity, can get out of balance. They can be unequanimous. And so we're trying to balance, and I put it up here, this ability to be open but non-attached. And so love, loving kindness, is a quality, it's an invitation to be open in a loving way. But the near enemy of loving kindness, when we start to kind of get lost in this sense of more of this realm, of pulled into it, and we lose wisdom, it turns into this possessiveness, or it turns into this kind of indulgence, or this exaggeration. And the way that I think about this, and this is how it's kind of taught as this getting lost in self-indulgence or exaggeration or possessiveness. I think about this like in romantic relationships, like the beginning stage they call the honeymoon phase, which is the kind of like emotion of chemistry, that like attraction, which actually I don't think is bad at all. I think it's a wonderful feeling. And I know that over the years I actually learned, I thought that that's what love was. And so I didn't really have many successful relationships because once that changed, because the feelings change, right? Because that's actually a person, it's not just a feeling. And that person's complex. I'm a person, I'm going to change, they're going to change, so the feeling's going to change. I was like, damn, I must not be in love anymore. Or they must not love me anymore. And so I think of, that feeling? That's kind of what they call the near enemy. And this also shows up in non-romantic ways, in ways that I try to be loving in, maybe friendships or work relationships, which can often be like, I can have difficulty making decisions because I am afraid of disappointing others. So where I get attached is that, like, I want people to like me, but at the expense of, like, I'll withhold something that's true for me. Like, I won't speak about the thing that's not working or the thing that's hurting, or I won't say no to something that I don't have space for. And that's a form of attachment, right? Like, go figure, people-pleasing sounds like, oh man, you must be really nice to everyone. Like, that's a good character, shortcoming to have. And it's like, no, that's also like, when I'm caught up in that stuff, it's this fear of not disappointing. It's this kind of not letting go, not letting other people make their own decisions with the information that they might need sometimes. Right? And so once I started recognizing this, I was like, oh shit. That's how I think I'm often being loving, but love and, for example, healthy boundaries can coexist. Love and expressing what I want can coexist, but I have to be willing sometimes to recognize that my relationship may change. So does that make sense, kind of? I think of it this way. I think of it as like, the Buddha is saying, not life is suffering. I think he's saying life is inherently vulnerable, and you can't escape it. And you attempt to control it. You attempt to control the vulnerability. And people-pleasing, for me, or getting lost in this type of love of not wanting to disappoint, is an attempt to control something very vulnerable, which is, if I tell Peter, hey man, I wasn't cool with what you did, and he says, hey man, well, I'm not cool with that, I guess we can't be friends, that sucks. I don't know, maybe I'm getting on my soapbox. I've been kind of on this piece lately. I think it's because I'm a therapist, and people are all my clients are so, like, wonderful. I love them. I'm like, these people are so good. They just struggle with boundaries. They fear rejection. We all have so much shame, and myself included. And sometimes I just want to squeeze them and be like, love yourself. I love you. Yes, it's hard and scary. That person may leave you, and that's going to suck. Well, he'd be here for you. The near enemy of compassion is overwhelm or pity, which again is looking at more of how we open ourselves up and we can kind of get lost. True compassion has to be sustainable, right? It has to balance compassion for myself and compassion for the other. Right? Like, I can't really take on others' emotions, or I can't really take on the responsibility of others' emotions. I can feel them and be open. That's equanimity too, because equanimity is being open. But I need to also recognize that I cannot fix, that I cannot even alleviate some of the times the pain that they're in. And when we're on the flip side of this, it's not what we really want anyway. Like, when I'm in pain and I'm suffering, I never want my friend to be like, how can I fix that for you? I just want them to be like, man, I'm sorry, dude, I love you. Thanks for calling me. I'm happy to talk anytime I'm free. It's like, oh, cool, that's all I want. But I forget that when I'm in the other role sometimes. So we can become overwhelmed, or we can kind of get caught in pity. And compassion, therefore, when we kind of move into the territory of self-pity or pity, it can turn into losing sight of someone's ability to affect change in their own life. It can be disempowering, actually. And so we're talking about the near enemies. It's kind of like what Carl Jung's talking about, the shadow side. Like, these are the kind of other sides of attachment in these areas. And then with mudita, or sympathetic joy, the near enemy is, so sympathetic joy, for those that are new, is actually taught traditionally as having joy for other people's happiness. And it's an antidote to jealousy. It's a really beautiful thing that the Buddha included. But the opposite, or the near enemy, I should say, is actually when we kind of like think we're pumped about someone else's joy, but we're kind of lost in this craving or this kind of like feeding off their success. We can kind of get lost in almost thinking joy and success are the same thing. Does that make sense? And so if we're keeping this awareness of impermanence intact, it's like, all right, well, success will come and success will go, but we're really trying to have joy for more of an authentic happiness that others may have. You know, not that we can't appreciate other people's success, but that maybe that they worked really hard for it. We can appreciate how much effort they've put in, or we can appreciate their ability to stay connected to their friends even though they had a lot of success, or we could appreciate maybe their generosity even though they had a lot of financial success, or whatever. Just so it doesn't have to like not be about that, but the emphasis is on these other qualities. And sometimes we can get lost in the material. Does that make sense? Okay. And then lastly, even equanimity itself needs to be practiced with equanimity. Because equanimity can come off, I think especially as I was first learning about it, it can kind of come off as this almost like spiritually bypassing, this kind of like, hey man, like whatever, you know, like I'm not connected to the outcomes here, like whatever happens, happens. And it can kind of fall into this almost like cold indifference, which is not really engagement. Again, remember, I think the Buddha is saying that we want to be connected to the vulnerability. Life has this vulnerability. And so equanimity does not mean that we're able to outsmart our suffering and our pain. It means that we're like willing to really actually engage. So we make decisions. We say, no, that doesn't feel right, and so I'm going to say that doesn't feel right, I'm going to walk away from that thing. Rather than, whatever, I'll just leave that hanging and see what happens. You know? So this is a really tricky one for me because it's like, oh, I've got to really examine if I'm really present and connected with some of these more volatile and emotional parts of my life. Or am I just kind of sweeping them under the rug? And that's tricky. Has anyone seen Inside Out 2?
No, not 2.
I highly recommend. I was blown away. We went and saw Inside Out 2. I think it's even better than Inside Out 1. But in one part of it, this isn't a spoiler. No, it's just like a mechanism of the world, right? But there's this mechanism in the world that they introduced that, like, the emotions in this little girl's brain can take these experiences that the little girl's having and they can like fly them to they call it the back of the mind. And so they have this like little chute, like at the old, you know, the bank where you used to send those, like the money up in those little chutes. So they have this little chute and they'll just like throw these things to the back of the mind, right? And I think of like this near enemy of equanimity is this kind of trying to push things to the back of the mind. So equanimity, being fully open and engaged with the flow of life without attempting to fix, manage, or control. This is very hard. So what does this mean? We lead into the vulnerability of our lives and we know that we can't do it perfectly. We try to be present. We try to be intentional. The good news is I've never found myself going in the wrong direction when I've followed truly good intentions. Like if I'm really intentional about the way I want to show up, even if the result's not the result I want, or maybe not the result that the other person wanted, that I can usually have a lot more humility, I can make amends, I can learn. You know, I'm a lot more open when I'm being present and intentional about how I'm moving through the world. So the good news is there's no right and no wrong, you know, but it's good to have this sense of going in a good direction, you know, some things to guide us. And so some of the other parts of Buddhism or the Buddha's Eightfold Path fold into this, like the training precepts, which is basically having an intention to not cause harm, or practicing renunciation, right? It's hard to have equanimity when we maybe get too busy, like was shared earlier. Or we're not managing our emotional capacity. So I'm not able to really show up the way I want to because I want to do all the things. And there's some maybe attachment there. So practicing renunciation. Of course, in meditation is one of the primary ways we can sit down with our direct experience. You know, what a wonderful way to cultivate equanimity is sitting down in the morning for 15 or 20 minutes and just being present with whatever comes up. In our daily life, we can reflect on our habit patterns. We can see these same reactive patterns that come up in our meditation come up in our daily life. We can see them with more clarity. We can pull back from those reactive patterns. And it all comes back to impermanence. Painful feelings will change. How can we bear them right now, though? How can we open to the painful experiences now? And if there are none, you don't have to go looking for them, they'll come. How can you enjoy the reprieve, the pleasant experience? There's this teaching in Buddhism called the worldly winds. It's pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, status and disgrace. And the Buddha says that this world, he calls it samsara, is a world that is whipped around by these winds. Pleasure, pain, gain, loss, praise, blame, status, disgrace. And he says the beautiful thing is that you don't have to just try to get one and not the other anymore. You'll get both. And we can have compassion for the times that are hard, for the pain, for the loss, for the blame, for the disgrace. And we can have non-attached appreciation for the gain and the pleasure and the praise and the status.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.